Rip Van Winkle, Session 1, Unit 10, Lesson 1, pages 36 through 43. Chapter 1. Whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed every hour of the day, produces some change in the magical hues and shapes of these mountains. When the sky is fair, the mountains are clothed in blue and purple. They print their bold outlines on the clear evening sky, but sometimes they will gather a hood of gray mist about their summits, which, in the last rays of the setting sun, will glow and light up like a crown of glory. At the foot of these fairy mountains a traveler may see wisps of smoke curling up from a village founded by some of the first Dutch colonists. Some of the original settlers' houses still stand. They are built of small yellow bricks brought from Holland, with latticed windows and gable fronts, each topped with a weathercock. In that same village, and in one of those very houses, which to tell the truth was sadly time-worn and weather-beaten, there once lived a simple good-natured fellow by the name of Rip Van Winkle. Rip was a great favorite among the men and women. The children would shout with joy whenever he approached. Rip taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles. He told them long stories of strange adventures. Whenever he walked about the village he was surrounded by a troop of them. They hung on his legs, clambered on his back, and played 1,000 tricks on him. Not a dog would bark at him throughout the neighborhood. The only trouble with Rip was that he did not like to work. Oh, he would sit on a wet rock and fish all day even if he didn't get a single nibble. He would carry a fowling piece on his shoulder for hours, trudging through woods and swamps, up hill and down dale, to shoot a few squirrels or wild pigeons. And he would never refuse to help a neighbor. But as to doing his family duty and keeping his farm in order, he found it impossible. In short, Rip was ready to attend to everybody's business except his own. Rip Van Winkle was one of those happy men who take the world easy. They eat white bread or brown, whichever can be got with the least thought or trouble. They would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left to himself he would have been perfectly content to whistle his life away, but his wife constantly shouted at him about his laziness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Morning, noon, and night her tongue was busy scolding him, and a sharp tongue is the only edged tool that grows keener with constant use. Rip had only one way of replying to her lectures. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, looked up to the sky, and said nothing. This made her even angrier, so he ended up taking to the outside of the house and the peace of the village streets. Rip's walks usually ended at the village inn. On a bench before the inn, under a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III, some of the village men sat in the shade, talking over village gossip, or telling endless sleepy stories about nothing. The most respected of all these sages was Nicholas Vedder, the landlord of the inn. He sat at the door from morning till night, moving only enough to avoid the sun and keep in the shade of a large tree. The neighbors could tell the hour by his movements as accurately as by a sundial. Vedder rarely spoke, and he smoked his pipe incessantly, yet his friends understood him perfectly. When anything that was said displeased him, he smoked his pipe, sending forth short, angry puffs. When he was pleased, he would inhale the smoke slowly, then blow out light, gentle clouds. Sometimes he would take the pipe from his mouth, let the fragrant smoke curl about his nose, and gravely nod his head. But even from this friendly place Rip was driven by his wife. Nearly every afternoon Dame Van Winkle would break in upon the group and shatter the peace of the day. She would shout at all the men, accusing them of encouraging Rip's laziness. Poor Rip was at last reduced almost to despair. To escape from the labor of the farm and clamor of his wife, his only choice was to take gun in hand and stroll away into the woods with his dog Wolf. "Poor Wolf," Rip would say, "your dame makes it a dog's life. But never mind, my boy. While I live you will always have a friend to stand by you." Wolf would wag his tail and look lovingly into his master's face. If dogs can feel pity, I believe Wolf returned the feelings with all his heart. Chapter 2. One fine autumn afternoon Rip wandered up one of the highest peaks of the Catskill Mountains. He was after his favorite sport of squirrel shooting, and the still solitudes echoed with reports of his gun. Late in the afternoon, panting and exhausted, he threw himself on a small green hill near the edge of a cliff. On one side he could see all the lower country for many miles around. He saw the lordly Hudson far, far below him, moving on its silent but majestic course until it disappeared into the blue mountains. On the other side he looked down into a wild mountain glen. He gazed deep into the glen until the mountains began to throw their long blue shadows over the valleys. Rip saw that it would be dark long before he would reach the village, and he sighed when he thought of encountering the terrors of Dame Van Winkle. As he was about to start down the mountain he heard a voice hollowing, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" Rip turned and saw nothing but a crow flying overhead. He took another step and heard, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" Wolf bristled up his back, gave a low growl, and crept to his master's side. Rip felt a terrible fear stealing over him. Both Rip and Wolf looked nervously into the glen. A strange figure appeared, slowly climbing the rocks. He was bent under the weight of something he carried on his back. Rip was surprised to see another human being in this lonely place. He thought it must be one of the villagers in the need of his help, so he hurried down to offer a hand. As he got closer he was still more surprised. The stranger was a short, square-built old fellow with thick bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His clothes were of the old Dutch fashion, like those worn by the settlers hundreds of years before. He wore a cloth jerkin strapped around his waist and a pair of wide breeches decorated with rows of buttons down the sides. The stranger made signs for Rip to help him with the barrel he carried. Though suspicious of the fellow, Rip moved quickly to help him. Together they climbed higher into the Catskills. As they made their way up, every now and then Rip heard long rolling peals like thunder that seemed to come out of a deep ravine between the highest rocks. During the whole time Rip and his companion walked in silence. Though Rip greatly wondered what could be the reason for carrying a barrel up this wild mountain, there was something strange and mysterious that filled him with awe and made him reluctant to speak. They passed through the ravine, which opened into a hollow. In the center was a group of the oddest-looking men playing at ninepins. Some wore short doublets, while others wore jerkins and long knives in their belts. Most of them wore enormous breeches like the man Rip had followed. Their faces, too, were peculiar. One had a large beard, broad face, and small piggish eyes. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of nose, and was topped by a white sugar loaf hat with a red cock's tail. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman with a weather-beaten face. He wore a lace doublet, broad belt, high-crowned hat and a feather, red stockings, and high-heeled shoes with roses in them. The whole group reminded Rip of something out of an old painting that he had seen in the village. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that though these folks seemed to be amusing themselves, their faces were grave, and they kept a mysterious silence. Nothing interrupted the stillness but the noise of the balls, which, whenever they were rolled, echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. As Rip and the man approached them, they suddenly stopped their play. They turned and stared at Rip. Rip's heart turned within him and his knees knocked together. The man filled large flagons with liquid from the barrel. Then he made signs for Rip to serve the company. He obeyed with fear and trembling. The strange men quaffed their drinks in terrible silence, then returned to their game. Slowly, Rip's fear relaxed its hold on him. When no one was looking, he even dared to taste the liquid in one of the flagons. One taste led to another and another and another. Before he knew it, his eyes swam in his head and he fell into a deep sleep. When Rip awoke, he found himself near the glen where he had first seen the strange man. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes. "Surely I have not slept here all night," thought Rip. He tried to remember what happened before he fell asleep. The strange man with the barrel, the mountain hollow, the strange sad men playing at ninepins, the flagon. Oh, that flagon! What wicked flagon, thought Rip. What excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle? He looked around for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found only an old firelock lying by him. The barrel was encrusted with rust, the lock was falling off, and the stock was worm-eaten. He now suspected that the grave men of the mountain had played a trick on him. Perhaps they had waited till he fell asleep, then robbed him of his gun. Wolf, too, had disappeared, but he might have strayed away after a squirrel or partridge. Rip whistled after him and shouted his name, but all in vain. The echoes repeated his whistle and shout, but no dog was to be seen. He decided to go back to the hollow. If he met any of the strange men, he would demand his dog and gun. As he rose to walk, he felt stiff and sore. "These mountain beds do not agree with me," thought Rip. With some difficulty he got down into the glen and found the path he and the man had followed. But to his surprise a mountain stream was now foaming down it, leaping from rock to rock. Rip scrambled up the sides of the stream to where the ravine had opened into the hollow, but the hollow was filled with rocks, and over the rocks a waterfall tumbled in a sheet of feathery foam. Here, then, Rip was brought to a standstill. Again he called and whistled after his dog. He was only answered by the calling of a flock of crows. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip was hungry. He was sad to give up his dog and gun. He was terrified of meeting his wife, but it would not do to starve in the mountains. Rip shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelock, and with a heart full of worry turned his steps homeward.